what you're doing when you pick up the subjects for these kinds of studies, what you're almost inevitably doing is picking up subjects who are already working within a particular cultural and religious tradition. We don't know what they were like before. Typically, we don't know what they were like before they started meditating. You can go to an ashram, you can go to a Zen the monastery and study Zen monks or study yogis, but you have no idea what they were like as teenagers, how they thought. There are self-selection problems in this kind of research. Maybe people who are maybe the kinds of people who want to meditate were already highly de-automatized in their patterns of thought to begin with. There are all sorts of problems. And then there are problems of kind of random selection. If you're going to study a meditator, you want to study skilled meditators, but that's not a random sample of people in the world. If you want to study meditation, you've got to be able to disentangle the effects of the meditative experience from the personality and cognitive characteristics of the meditator. So there are all sorts of problems here, but the existence of those problems hasn't prevented a number of investigators from trying to explore meditation as a route to de-automatization in various ways. And most of this research has involved the Stroop paradigm, but not all of it. Here's an interesting set of studies. These have to do with EEG activity in meditation. What these studies do is they take active meditators, Zen monks, yogis, or whatever, attach a bonnet of electrodes to their heads, record the electroencephalogram before, during, and after the meditation, and then do various other kinds of things with them while they're meditating. One thing we know is that when individuals are meditating, they generate high levels of alpha activity in the EEG. This used to be thought of as a sign of meditation and a physical sign that people were engaging in experiencing an altered state of consciousness, because there's a lot more alpha activity in the EEG of a meditator than you would find in an ordinary person who's just kind of sitting there looking, until you realize what some of the correlates, or what some of the confounds are. In the first place, if you just close your eyes and don't think about too much, the increase of the alpha activity will increase greatly. The density of alpha activity will increase greatly, even if you're not meditating. The single most effective way to increase alpha activity in your brain is simply to close your eyes. Prevent yourself from looking at something. Well, what do people do when they meditate? Well, they usually close their eyes, okay? So you don't know how much of that increase is due to meditation and how much of it is due to eye closure, unless you do the obvious study. But there are more interesting things to be talked about here, one of which is that this increased density of alpha activity can be abolished, and a phenomenon known as alpha blocking, by the occurrence of some kind of unexpected stimulus in the environment. So you have somebody close his eyes, the EEG records that they're generating lots of alpha activity, and then you just make some kind of surprising, unexpected sound, and what you'll see is that the alpha activity will disappear and be replaced by this high-frequency, low-amplitude beta activity. That's called the alpha blocking response, and if you do that often enough, the alpha blocking response will habituate, and the subject will no longer show it. Okay, here's where it gets interesting, because not only has it been claimed that meditators show increases in alpha activity, it's also been claimed that different meditative traditions have different effects on the so-called alpha blocking response. So, for example, here's a classic study, the very earliest scientific study of yoga meditation. The two experienced yogis who had EEG electrodes attached to them while they were meditating. And to make a long story short, the data is not presented graphically very well in this paper. But the report was that in yoga, there was an increase in the density of alpha activity in the brain. We'd expect that, okay? But interestingly, the yogis showed no blocking of alpha activity in response to an unexpected, surprising stimulus, which is quite interesting, okay? Because in yoga tradition, you're supposed to become oblivious to the world outside you. These yogis seemed to be, in fact, oblivious to the world outside them because they weren't responding at all to these novel, surprising stimuli. And because there was no blocking of the alpha activity to begin with, there was no habituation of the blocking response. This is a particularly interesting finding because precisely the same study was done on Zen Buddhist meditators a couple of years later with quite different results. Again, the Zen Buddhist meditators, like the yogis, showed increased alpha activity in their EEGs while they were meditating. And again, that might be a sign of meditation. It might just be an artifact of the fact that their eyes were closed. But what was really interesting was that the Zen masters who were meditating showed the alpha blocking response. Okay? They weren't oblivious to the world around them. They showed the alpha blocking response. What was interesting about the Zen meditators was that they didn't habituate. And if you think about the goal of Zen meditation, the goal of Zen meditation is to experience every event in the world as new and in and of itself and not apply preconceived categories or whatever. That's exactly what these the Zen meditators seem to be doing because they weren't habituating to this stimulus. They didn't say to themselves, as it were, oh, that's the same thing I heard before. You know, what they were saying was, ooh, this is new. You know, even though it was the same thing that they were hearing before. Very provocative set of results. Unfortunately for the story, okay, there's been only one attempt to replicate this study. I don't know why people haven't done this more often. I mean, really, it's just a sin scientifically that there's been no serious attempt to explore this. But Herbert, the two American psychophysiologists, Becker and Shapiro, tried to replicate this finding, comparing Zen practitioners, yoga practitioners, and practitioners of this yoga derivative known as transcendental meditation, both asking them to attend to the stimulus and to ignore the stimulus, and looking at alpha blocking and habituation to the alpha blocking. And what Becker and Shapiro found in their study was absolutely no difference between the Zen masters and the yogis, and absolutely no difference between the meditators and ordinary people under control. So we just don't know what to make of this. Somebody's got to straighten this out someday. You'd think after 30 years somebody would have done it, but nobody has. Okay, hint, hint. There's a study to be done here. But you can kind of get the logic of the research by looking at those original findings. Yogis are supposed to become oblivious to the world, and you can see that oblivion, if you will, in their failure to show the alpha blocking response. Zen masters are supposed to experience everything in the world as new and not approach it through preconceived categories or schemata, and they didn't show habituation of the alpha blocking response. It's exactly as would have been predicted by the goals of those respective meditative traditions. Here's another experiment, a more recent one by UC Berkeley's own Bob Levinson, Paul Ekman at UCSF, professor at UCSF, many of you have heard of, and of the interesting Buddhist monk, Matthew Ricard, he's either French or Swiss, I can't remember which, but in any event, he's a PhD biochemist who got interested in Tibetan Buddhism about 40 years ago, began practice meditation, and he's now a full-fledged Buddhist monk. And what Levinson and Ekman did with Ricard was to have him meditate and then look at his startle response to an unexpected stimulus, firing a gun off behind his head and things like that. It's called acoustic startle. It's a very common the procedure. And they had, again, because Ricard is a trained scientist, he was quite willing to do these kinds of things, had him practice various kinds of meditation, and then looked at his startle response. And there's a comparison here of controls. And what you can see here is that basically in terms of physiological aspects of the startle response, there were very few differences between Ricard and control subjects. Ricard did not show the physiological, the physical activity of startle. He didn't kind of turn around and say, just what's going on behind me, or whatever. But at a deeper physiological level, the startle reflex seemed to be pretty much preserved here, except, again, there were certain differences here, so that when he was meditating in what he called an open presence form of meditation, he showed very little cardiac response to the startle stimulus. When he was distracted from meditation, he showed a lot. So there were some differences, but in fact, most of those differences disappeared when you looked very deeply at the physiology of the startle response. Here's another example. This one also comes from Berkeley, from Professor David Presti in the MCB department. Presti and his colleagues had access to a large number of Tibetan monks who had had a fair number of years of training, either performing this compassion meditation that I talked about before, or this one-point meditation. These monks were trained in both meditative disciplines. What's interesting about this study is that Presti and his colleagues made use of a phenomenon known as binocular rivalry. And what happens in binocular rivalry is that you present through goggles two different stimuli, one to each eye. One eye gets a vertical grading, the other eye gets a horizontal grading. And as you know from your introductory psychology course, your introductory neuroscience course, what happens in vision is that the images from the retinas of the two eyes are fused further back in the visual system into a single three-dimensional percept. But that doesn't happen in binocular rivalry. What happens in binocular rivalry is that first you see the vertical grading, then you see the horizontal grading, and they keep going back and forth. You can't see both of them at the same time. You don't see a merged the percept. You see one or the other, and this alternation between the horizontal and the vertical is automatic. It's basically the way the way the visual system is built to work. And what they discovered was that binocular rivalry was reduced during various forms of meditation. So in compassion meditation, basically what you got was really no effect on binocular rivalry at all. Remember, in compassion meditation, you're supposed to be contemplating the suffering of the world. But in one-point meditation, there were effects on binocular rivalry, so that while these monks were engaged in one-point meditation, they actually